Right, so I'm starting a new series named Fact or Fiction. And the purpose of the series is to debunk some myths that I do see online. And today's question will be, do you need an RTX 4090 for ray tracing? So we'll be testing a bunch of games with the RTX 4070 Super paired with a 14600K of CPU. That again is paired with DDR5, 6400 mega transfers per second CL32 memory. And the games tested today will range from some Unreal Engine 5 games, even all the way up to Cyberpunk 2077. We're going to start this off with Lords of the Fallen, which is an Unreal Engine 5 game. We're running at 1440p on the Ultra preset. As you can see, it does support ray tracing, more lumen ray tracing. You can see if we hover over the global illumination quality there, it says high and above, use more accurate ray tracing methods to solve lighting, but can reduce performance. And the same goes for reflection quality, right? So just on the Ultra preset, 1440p, no upscaling, no frame generation, no nothing. And let's get right to it. So if we open up our frame rate counter here, we can see we're getting around 74 frames per second. I'm just going to run around it a little bit. I've already killed most of the enemies in this specific area, but I just wanted to show what the performance is like. And I'll be trying to keep this as short as I possibly can, but I do want to show you quite a few things here, including fighting. But as you can see, we haven't dropped below 60 frames per second here at all, and for a Souls-like, it's perfectly fine. There are some people that do want a high refresh rate experience, and I do understand that, but we're getting above 60 frames per second at all times here, even when there is some fighting. Now, I'm not entirely sure whether there are more demanding areas in this game. I'm not a big fan of the Souls genre because I do suck in them, so I haven't really progressed too much in this game. But as you can see here, getting an average of 74 frames per second. Our 1% lows are sitting at 54 and our 0.1% lows are sitting at 43. Now, you can improve the frame rate by just enabling some DLSS. The reason why I started off with native is because the same people that say you need an RTX 4090 for ray tracing don't believe in any upscaling, but I just showed you that in this specific game, you can get a very decent experience at native when ray tracing is enabled, and you also run on the Ultra preset. But kicking on DLSS quality here, we are getting a high refresh rate experience above 100 frames per second at all times. Well, in the specific area anyway. All right, let's move on to the next one. Next up, we've got Robocop Rogue City, which is also a new game running on Unreal Engine 5. We've got DLAA enabled here. Remember, DLAA is still native resolution. It just uses the anti-aliasing techniques from DLSS. And we are running on the Epic preset here with Lumen enabled. Now, for those of you who are unsure of what Lumen is, it's just the Unreal Engine's software ray tracing. It can be hardware accelerated as well if you do have RT cores. Anyway, so we are getting around 70 frames per second here. There are some dips below 60. I don't think it's due to ray tracing because it's generally when we have a lot of glass breaking. But during this whole fighting sequence here, you can see we very rarely drop below 60 frames per second. Now, I mean, it's not perfect, but it is perfectly playable. You do want a slightly higher, or most people want a slightly higher frame rate when they play first-person shooter games. This game does support FSR frame generation. It supports DLSS frame generation. It supports FSR, XeSS, and DLSS upscaling. So you can use any of those to increase your frame rate. And if you are, like we saw there, we dropped below 60 frames per second, we went into the low 50s, right, which is not ideal. So let's go ahead and just enable DLSS here. So you just change DLAA to DLSS quality here, and you'll see we get a pretty decent bump in the frame rate. I did not reset the numbers. I do apologize for that. But as you can see, we are now getting around 100 frames per second, and at times even 120 frames per second. So if you are okay with some upscaling, DLSS is definitely something to consider. All right, next up, we've got Cyberpunk, once again at 1440p. And this is, it shows custom preset, but it's basically just medium settings. And we do have ray traced lighting enabled just on medium at the moment. So I wanted to see what kind of performance we do get. Cyberpunk does have quite a few ray traced options. And as you can see in this pretty demanding area, which is at the just outside of V's original starting apartment, we're getting 60 frames per second, right? So sure, there is no reflections enabled, or RT reflections or RT shadows. So we'll go ahead and enable a bunch of the additional RT options as well, but just using ray traced lighting, global illumination, we do get a very decent playable experience. So if we enable sun shadows and local shadows as well, we'll not hit 60 frames per second. Once again, this is a pretty demanding scene, but we are dropping below 60 more often than I'd like. We do see 60 every now and again. Although if you do enable VSync with reflex on a 60 hertz monitor, you'll probably get around 57 frames per second. That's what reflex will do. It'll cap the frame rate to around 57 frames per second. Now, if we enable ray traced reflections, this is where it gets interesting, and we see a big drop in our performance. So sure, ray tracing is extremely demanding. I'm not going to do a full benchmark run here, but once again, all you can do is just enable DLSS set to quality here, and you'll get around double the performance. So we went from just over 40 to around 80 frames per second. So not really double, but it's a very, very big gain in the frame rate there. And DLSS at 1440p set to quality in this game looks pretty great. There's no issue whatsoever. I'd actually play at 1440p with DLSS set to balanced, and it's perfectly playable. So what if we enable path tracing? So path tracing is ray tracing on steroids, and I'm just going to go ahead and enable DLSS balanced here because path tracing is extremely demanding. We do have DLSS ray reconstruction enabled as well. And on the balance preset, we're not getting 60 frames per second. Okay, so sure, if you want to use path tracing, you're going to have to use a little bit of a stronger GPU. Although we can drop this down to DLSS performance, but personally, I don't like DLSS performance at 1440p. It just looks kind of too grainy, too blurry. But we also have DLSS frame generation in this game. But the purpose of this video is not to get playable experiences with frame generation and aggressive upscaling settings, etc. I just want to show you what kind of settings you can expect running at native or using minimal upscaling. And unfortunately, path tracing, DLSS performance, it definitely kind of defeats the purpose for me anyway. Right, so if we just switch it back to DLSS balanced and we enable frame generation here, now you'll see we get a nice 90 to 100 frames per second, but this does come at a cost, right? It does come at the cost of additional input latency. A lot of people don't like this. Sure, 90 frames per second final output with frame generation enabled is not perfect. I personally don't like it when we do get around 100 frames per second with frame generation enabled. I do aim for around 120. So me personally, with the 4070 Super, I do not use path tracing in Cyberpunk. All right, next up, we've got Doom Eternal. Once again, 1440p ray tracing is enabled here. We are rendering at native resolution, no DLSS, nothing, and we are running on the Ultra Nightmare preset. Now, for those of you who don't know, Ultra Nightmare is the highest setting you can actually use for Doom, and 8GB GPUs actually run out of VRAM using these settings. As you can see, our VRAM usage is sitting at 8.1 gigabytes of VRAM used, and that's not important though, because we are getting almost 200 frames per second with ray tracing enabled, native resolution 1440p on an RTX 4070 Super. I'd say that ray tracing is definitely usable on something other than a 4090. Now, sure, the intensity of ray tracing does differ between games. Doom has always run very well. The ID engine is phenomenal. Sure, it's smaller levels, but there's a lot of detail in these levels, and also they are full of enemies. So it's just a very, very well-performing game, even with ray tracing enabled, getting 100, almost 200 frames per second, right? So if you want to up that, let's just see what happens once we actually enable some upscaling. So we'll just enable a DLSS set to quality if I can find it. All right, there we go. So DLSS set to quality, and now we are getting almost 200 frames per second. Right, so, and it still looks plenty good. DLSS at 1440p using the quality preset looks phenomenal. As I said, you can go down to DLSS balanced, or I personally can go down to DLSS balanced. DLSS performance is just a little bit too much upscaling for me. All right, so next up we do have Dragon's Dogma 2, and this is one of the worst performing games ever. Like, we are still running at 1440p, just the rendering mode set to progressive instead of interlaced. Image quality is set to the middle, that's 100% render resolution. We are using TAA, and everything else is set to high or max except post-processing effects, and we also do have ray tracing enabled, right? All right, so no upscaling, no frame generation, no nothing. I'm just outside of one of the bigger cities here. The performance in the city is terrible, so I'm just testing outside. Not terrible due to ray tracing, it's terrible. These guys just keep on interrupting us. Anyway, so just terrible when it comes to CPU usage. I struggle to get 60 frames per second, even with the 14600KF CPU in the city. And frame generation does help with that. But as I said, once again, the purpose of this video is to show you what ray tracing can be like without any visual trickery like upscaling or frame generation. Right, so nothing much to see here, getting an average there of 80 frames per second. Anyway, next game we'll be testing is Dying Light 2, once again at 1440p. This will also be on the high preset, and we do have some ultra settings here. You need to enable ultra to enable ray tracing, right? So we've got ultra ray tracing for sun shadows. We do have global illumination quality set to ultra as well, reflections quality as ultra, and ray traced flashlight as well. Right, and it starts off pretty well. Remember, okay, it's raining now, so it is kind of more demanding than usual, but the further you go into the city here, you'll see our frame rate start to drop. Now we are getting below 60 frames per second. Remember, no upscaling, no frame generation, although the game does support both. We are struggling to hit 60 frames per second, or we're not hitting 60 frames per second. Even though the average says 60, it's because we started off pretty strong. Now, during fighting, the performance doesn't drop that much. The frame rate doesn't go down that much when fighting. So the frame rate stays in the low to mid 50s here. Not too terrible, but once again, as a first-person game, it is now a first-person shooter. Since they introduced guns, you do want slightly higher frame rate. So if we just kick on DLSS quality, we won't be changing anything else. We won't be enabling any frame generation, although, as I said, the game does support it. Now we are, once again, almost doubling our frame rate, right? So we went from 55 to 94 frames per second, 90 frames per second. So not a perfect doubling of the frame rate, but definitely a lot more playable. Once again, DLSS set to quality at 1440p looks great, looks phenomenal. There's you'll have to really pixel peep to see a difference, and at times the anti-aliasing aspect of DLSS can look better than TAA, right? So that's what people mean when they say DLSS can look better than native. It's the anti-aliasing aspect of it, right? Not the true pixel count. All right, anyway, so getting an average throw of 90 frames per second, so not too terrible. Next up, we do have Spider-Man Remastered. It's slightly older at this stage, but it also does have ray tracing. I just went through all my Steam games that I have that have ray tracing, so I tested everything. So we are on the very high preset, actually, just with ray tracing enabled. No upscaling, no frame generation. Once again, the game does support both, and we are slightly CPU bound at times, but we are getting an average of 86 frames per second, 90 in real time. But you'll see a little bit later, if we run down down on the street level, we do become CPU bound at times, and this is Spider-Man's biggest flaw. Not biggest flaw, but it does become a lot more CPU bound when you enable ray tracing. Right, so next up we've got Metro Exodus, the Enhanced Edition. This game you can't disable ray tracing, so we have got the Ultra Ray Tracing option enabled. Reflections are ray traced. We've got very high settings there. We don't have any VRS to try and improve our performance, and we are getting around 100 frames per second once again. Now, for a first-person shooter, this is perfectly fine. You can enable DLSS to get a slightly higher frame rate. Get around 120, 130 frames per second in this game with DLSS. And I mean, it's not needed unless you want to max out your high refresh rate monitor. I mean, sure, I'm also one of those people that prefer a much higher frame rate. So I do play with the frame generation enabled. I do play with the DLSS upscaling enabled. Anyway, so let's move on to Ratchet and Clank. Now, this game is slightly more demanding when it comes to ray tracing, and you also have quite a few more options, right? We've got reflections, shadows, and ambient occlusion, whereas in Spider-Man, we only had reflections. Even though it's from the same developer, developer, the menu looks looks identical, right? So we are getting the between 70 and 80 frames per second here. Now, when there's some fighting, some action on the screen here, we are dropping into the high 60s, mid 60s even, but we are staying well above 60 frames per second. So if your goal is to reach 60 frames per second, which is perfectly playable for games like this, then you can use ray tracing at native resolutions with a $550 GPU. That's how much I paid for this RTX 4070 Super, by the way. And a 4090 in my country currently costs around $2,200. So literally a quarter of the price of a 4090. And here we are playing games with ray tracing enabled at native resolution without any trickery like frame generation or DLSS upscaling, right? So make of that what you will. Sure, if you want a higher frame rate, then you're going to need a more powerful GPU. Right, so next up, we do have Star Wars Jedi Survivor, another Souls-like that I haven't finished. I mean, Souls-like, it's got similar gameplay experiences. Anyway, so we are running on the high preset here, 1440p with ray tracing enabled. We are in this Kobo area, which is extremely demanding actually, and this is also the area that's used for many YouTube videos to show the poor performance of this game. You can see that the stuttering is all over the place, but it's not due to us using ray tracing. Even if you disable ray tracing, there's lots of stuttering in this game, in this specific area, even a lot of traversal stutter. And as you can see, we're getting an average of 72 frames per second, which is perfectly fine. Now, if you want to up that a little bit, let's go in and enable DLSS quickly. So we'll just use DLSS set to quality. Once again, we do have a frame generation as well, which we'll not use for this specific video, as I mentioned earlier. So with DLSS set to quality, we're getting the same frame rate. Okay, so we are CPU bound in this specific scenario, getting around 70% GPU usage, 60 to 80, I mean, give or take. And our average frame rate is sitting at 74. And at times it even drops slightly lower than without DLSS, which is kind of strange because we saw 60 frames per second there, which is the lowest I've seen. All right, so let's move on to The Witcher Wild Hunt. This one is also very, very demanding when it comes to ray tracing, right? So we've got all the ray traced options enabled. We do have TAAU, but without any resolution scaling. As you can see, there's no real option for you to just select native, so we'll just use a TAAU without a resolution scale. I do have all the post-processing effects disabled, and the rest of the settings are set to high. I do test in a very demanding area as well. This is where I perform most of my Witcher 3 benchmarks, and you can see that we're not hitting 60 frames per second. Okay, so this game is also developed by CD Projekt Red, the same developers as Cyberpunk 2077, and ray tracing in this game is extremely demanding. Not as demanding as a Cyberpunk, but it comes pretty close, right? So what happens if we just change a few of the ray traced options here? I mean, that's why these options are there, if I can find it. So let's just disable reflections. So for example, let's see if we've got ray trace global illumination set to quality with the shadow options enabled. We did not see that big of a gain. We went from 52 to 53 frames per second, right? Maybe it's because in the specific scene we do not have that many reflections. So let's just drop the global illumination quality to performance and see, like, we're getting closer to 60 frames per second, right? 57 frames per second, not still not 60. I'm trying to hit 60 in case you haven't noticed. Right, so let's disable the shadows and ambient occlusion here. Let's just set ray trace global illumination to quality again. I just want to see which one is the more demanding one. And there you have it. Almost 60 frames per second. Now, once again, if you use VSync and G-Sync with Reflex, you'll get around 57 frames per second as well if you do run on a 60 Hz monitor, all right? So definitely not the end of the world. This game is perfectly playable at 60 frames per second, except I can't run. So what happens if we just want a slightly higher frame rate here? I'm just going to go back in and enable all the ray traced options. Remember, we got around 50 frames per second with that. Then we'll just enable DLSS. Once again, not aggressive upscaling. We'll just use quality, and let's see what kind of performance we're getting now. And we're getting 70 frames per second, right? So perfectly playable for this type of game. Once again, it all boils down to personal preference. What is it that you want to achieve? Do you want a high refresh rate experience, or do you just want, are you happy with 60 frames per second? Because if you are aiming for a high refresh rate experience with ray tracing enabled, but you don't want to use any upscaling or frame generation tech, then obviously you're going to have to need a 4090 for that. And just remember that a 4070 Super at 1440p is not that far off from a 4090 at 4K. Right, so to answer the question, do you need an RTX 4090 for ray tracing? Absolutely not.